Hello and welcome to Arcane Carolinas at DragonCon as a part of the American Sci-Fi Classics Track.
Welcome to DragonCon 2021.
This will be sort of a sequel to what we did last year, which was Cryptids and Classic Sci-Fi.
It is so good to be able to finally talk about these stories too, because we have been talking about doing something for DragonCon 2021 since DragonCon goes virtual in 2020. And like the topics that we're going to talk about, we have been talking to each other about how much we want to talk about them for literally a year.
And then I screwed it up because I'm throwing you a curveball, and the one that you thought I was going to talk about, I'm not doing today.
That's okay though, because the ones that I was already excited to talk about, I'm still talking about.
So anyway, if you're not familiar with Arcane Carolinas, we are a podcast, traditional audio only podcast. We generally don't do video, but today we are. We cover myths, legends, modern, weird, X-Files type stuff out of the Carolinas. I'm your co-host, Charlie Mushaw.
I'm your co-host, award-winning novelist, Michael G. Williams.
And last year, we got a lot of positive feedback when we talked about smaller cryptid stories and then drew parallels to science fiction and horror movies where similar creatures were represented. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. We have 3 smaller stories about 3 different cryptid sightings across North Carolina, South Carolina, and because DragonCon is in Georgia as well.
Yeah, we really love the way that the sort of stuff that we like to talk about has been represented in pop culture. In my case, partly because the way that this stuff has been represented in pop culture is how I got into some of these topics in the first place. And last year we had a lot of fun talking about different critters from around the Carolinas and Georgia. And I'm really excited about the ones that we have for this year too. I keep saying that, but it's still true.
And one last thing before we start getting into it. If you have an interest in swag, if you want some buttons and stickers and stuff, drop us an email, arcanecarolinas@gmail.com, and we'll get stuff in the mail to you. Just put DragonCon in the subject and we'll turn stuff around to you. Tell us where to send it and we'll send it to you. Because normally when we do a con in person, we have a big box of stuff that we like to give out, and we want to recreate that experience even though we're virtual. So if you want some free stuff, email us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. Tell us where you would like us to send said free stuff, and we'll take care of you.
And something that I haven't run past you yet, Charlie, so feel free to say that this is not allowed.
Oh, good.
I'll be sending a copy of one of my paperback books to one of the people who responds to us for free stuff, drawn at random.
But let's up the ante. Let's make it. There's one grand prize winner that gets a whole bunch of stuff, including our trading card sets. That'd be pretty cool, right?
Yeah, that's going to be really, really cool.
And a koozie. I'll put a koozie in there too. I don't know. I guess I should clarify what the trading card sets are. We do wax pack, baseball card style trading cards about weird stuff. Here's one about vampires.
I'm wearing the shirt for the one about vampires.
Here's one about aliens, UFOs.
Yeah.
Anyway, point is, there's a whole series of them, and we'll make sure you get series 1 included with the super deluxe book bundle, which I still haven't read any of your books.
That's okay. They're not for everybody. Yeah.
It's funny that we get asked that. I feel like we're rambling. We're not going to get to the story.
We're going to get to the story. Don't worry.
We get asked that at conventions all the time. And I've told you this, where people will come up and be like, how are his books? I'm like, oh, I hear they're very good. People really like them. You know, he's won awards. Like, you haven't read them? I'm like, I am capable of reading, but I have not read his books.
And that's okay. Like you said the other day, it's not a prereq for friendship.
It's become my favorite bit. Because I guess because people don't want to ask you. They're like, which one would you recommend? And I'm like,
I can give you a canned answer for that one, but I like the fact that your answer is beats me.
All right. You are taking 2 creatures this year because I took 2 creatures last year. So why don't you start off with one? I'll do one, and then you'll get us across the finish line.
Okay. A lot of times when we talk about a legend in North Carolina or South Carolina, we always like to start by talking a little about the place where the legend is set. Mm-hmm. And so my first one is going to be the Demon Dog of Valley Crucis, North Carolina, which is one of my favorite weird little legends. And it's kind of perfect for one of these multi-creature episodes because there's not actually a ton to the legend, but it's really fun. So Valley Crucis, North Carolina, it's a very tiny community. It's one of those places, we've talked about this before in other episodes, talked about this in appropriately the ghost town of Goshen Hill. It is what is referred to in the census as a populated place. It is not a town. It's not a township. It's nothing formal, but it is a populated place by the Census Bureau standards. Valley Crucis is Latin for Valley of the Cross because Episcopal Bishop Levi Ives looked down on the valley from one of the peaks around it, according to legend, when he was traveling through the area in the 1830s and saw three creeks converge in the shape of a cross. Or in some versions, he saw two crosses at opposite ends of the valley where different creeks crossed each other. Nobody knows where that is today. And if you go look at a map, there are no creeks that do this. But partly that's because this is an intensely flood-prone area. And so the waterways have been redone by nature repeatedly in the time since.
Give him the story. I can buy that there was a creek with a cross at some point.
As somebody said in one of the interviews that I read about that part of the origin of the town, it might be a legend, but if so, we like the legend. And I'm like, sure, that's great. That's a great answer. I liked it a lot. On Ives' recommendation, the Episcopal Church established Holy Cross Mission in Valley Crucis and started operating a school and holding services in 1842. This was at a time when this was a very rural area.
That's something that we've talked about. A lot of things in Western North Carolina and South Carolina until the rail lines were really built out there over the course of the 1800s. Like there wasn't much out there.
You know, usually when we talk about a place, we make sure to do a dive into some of the indigenous history and talk about the indigenous peoples who lived there and the cultures that occupied that place before colonizers showed up. There isn't even much of a record of that in this area because it's very remote. There have been archaeological digs along the banks of the Watauga River in what's now Valley Crucis, and they have found pottery shards and bones and you know, evidence of habitation and hunting, but largely this was probably a hunting ground. We've talked about how the Cherokee, especially in very large game areas and nature preserves, where they wouldn't build towns, but they would make use of those places for hunting purposes. And it's probably that this was one of those areas for them, in part because when you're that high up the mountain, the winters are exceptionally difficult.
Wonderful.
And it just wouldn't be an easy place to keep itself going.
Depends on if you like the cold and snow and rain, which I do.
Yeah, pretty much.
So I'm moving to Valley Crucis. There's no one there to bother me, and I can sit and be cold. It'll be great.
Yeah, you would love it there, legitimately. Ives also established in Valley Crucis the first Episcopalian monastery since the Reformation. And in fact, it was very controversial in the Episcopal Church because a lot of people felt that it was too Catholic to have a monastery.
Yeah, that's not something you really hear about.
It was very unusual. The mission was actually abandoned in the 1850s as not being very successful. An Episcopal deacon in the area named William Skiles established a second Episcopal church named St. John's on the other side of the valley on what's now a dead-end dirt road, and that's important.
So they were fighting for turf.
Yeah. So that church got built in 1862, and it is also still standing, just FYI.
I feel like this is a bit like there was this intersection growing up where you could stand in a McDonald's parking lot and look across the road to a Walmart that had a McDonald's. And then if you turned to the right, you would see the next shopping center also had a McDonald's.
Yeah. So, it's like in Best in Show when Parker Posey's character says that she met her husband because they were coming out of Starbucks that were across the street from each other. Yeah. Very much like that.
Okay.
Then in the 1890s, the Episcopal Church got interested in that original mission again. They built a second mission school and a working farm, both of which were very successful. They started teaching people in the area. There was a lot of like adult literacy program as part of that school, which I think is really great. And then by the 1920s, they had built a hydroelectric plant and were providing electricity to the community 100 years ago, which I think is really fascinating.
That is pretty wild.
That's Valley Crucis. It's still a very small place, very low population, and a lot of it is actually protected because it's part of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And there's very little new development there, which I think is great. The legend of the demon dog of Valley Crucis.
Dog. I wanted to be like, the demon dog. And then, yip, 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 yip. This like tiny little dog comes.
That would be amazing.
He's a tiny demon.
I have met that Chihuahua. So the most often repeated version of this legend is framed as being typical of sort of the reports that people have of seeing the demon dog. And this is the version that you'll hear or see or read if you Google this, if you find a book on legends of Western North Carolina. Anything that mentions the demon dog is going to have this version in it. But I want to note that, to go back to that Ghost Town of Goshen Hill episode we did in the regular podcast feed, in that I mentioned that the book Folk Tales of South Carolina, published in 1941, as a brief aside, mentions that there have for many years been reports of a similar dog in Valley Crucis, North Carolina. So the legend predates this version of the legend.
Okay.
The version is two young men, often described as students from Appalachian State University in Boone, which is about 10 miles away, were driving along North Carolina Highway 194 in the middle of the night on their way back to Boone. As they passed, quote, the old stone church just on the edge of town, they saw something enormous leap from the graveyard beside the church into the middle of the road, blocking their path. So the guys swerve to get around whatever has just leapt into the road. They pull off onto the shoulder to catch their breath. They look behind them to see what it was, assuming that it's probably a deer or maybe a bear. And it's a dog that one of them described later as tall as a man and twice as wide.
So it's not a little yip, 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 yip. It's huge. It's massive.
Enormous.
Bigger than the dog monsters from Ghostbusters.
I would say at least that big, but significantly larger, most likely.
Wow, freaky.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a dog. Anyway, I think we've transcended dog status, but go on.
They said as they sat there looking at it that it had like huge, slavering jaws, and it was like growling and very menacing. Yeah, very much. And it had like big shaggy fur, weirdly matted, and that its eyes glowed red, and not red because their taillights were reflected in its eyes, but as if lit from within by fire.
Bioluminescent red.
Yes.
That is a vivid description.
Isn't it? I love it.
His eyes burn with the fires of the seventh layer of hell.
And so then the dog like snarls at them as they're sitting there looking at it. And in this legend, one of them says to the other, did you see that? And the other says, no, and neither did you. And then puts his foot down on the gas, and they just like tear off down the highway, trying to get away from it. As they are speeding around these mountain roads, trying to get to and through Valley Crucis and escape the demon dog, it begins chasing them. And not only is it keeping up with them, but it's gaining on their car. And so they're driving faster and faster and faster. And eventually they just tear through the middle of Valley Crucis, across a bridge, over, according to the legend, one of the streams that forms across.
Yes.
And when they get to the other side, they have to slow down for a curve. And one of them looks back and sees that the demon dog...
It's just waving. It's standing at the bridge. Y'all come back now, you hear?
It's like, wouldn't you like to stop for a souvenir? They look back, and the demon dog, which was almost caught up to the car, is just standing on the far side of the bridge, snarling at them. And then as they watch, waiting to see, is it going to start chasing us again, it vanishes into thin air.
Freaky, and I love it.
And according to this version of the legend, the two of them then drive to Boone and spend the night in an all-night diner, because they certainly are not going to do any more sleeping, because they know they have seen something hostile and supernatural.
I like a good all-night diner. I get it.
And there are a lot of other reported sightings. Like I said, in this book, Folk Tales of South Carolina from 1941, it gets mentioned there in passing as like there's yet another demon dog in the Carolinas somewhere. So I find this really interesting that legend is old enough. And in all the versions that I can find, they describe this as being something that hails from the earliest time that people can remember there being a church on Highway 194.
What if it was a demon dog, like the meme?
What if it's demon cryptocurrency? That would be very believable, because I'm pretty sure cryptocurrency is demonic.
Demon dog coin.
Yes.
So obviously the area was not settled. It was likely a game land. Church gets put down. Demon dogs start being seen.
Yeah.
This is not a dog. I understand that that's the descriptor, but a dog the size of a horse.
Yeah.
To your point. Yeah.
And if you go digging for where is the church, because in most of the versions, they don't name which church it is. They just say it's the Old Stone Church on Highway 194. You'll see people say that it is St. John's Episcopal Church, but St. John's Episcopal Church is that second one that's on that dead end dirt road. There's no way that people are driving through anywhere, going to anywhere on a dead end dirt road and passing by St. John's Episcopal Church. It's got to be Holy Cross Episcopal Church. And that's important because what are demon dogs? What are the legends of demon dogs? There are a ton of legends of demon dogs. This part of the Appalachians was almost entirely settled by Scottish and Irish immigrants. And there were a lot of English immigrants too, or people from very northern England or very southern lowland mainland Scotland. And the UK is just chock full of black dog or demon dog or devil dog.
Yes,
stories.
we have many demon dogs. We do.
It's true though. Like you go looking into this stuff, and there's basically a demon dog story for every town in the UK, in this part of the UK. And they're often associated with crossroads or specific roads between villages, but they're described with glowing red eyes, lit from within, shaggy fur, huge teeth, huge claws, preternatural speed, a fixation on specific victims. Sometimes they chase people away from graveyards, all the stuff that's a part of this story. And they're considered an ill omen. And in some places, seeing a black dog or hearing it bark was a harbinger of death, just like a banshee. Most interestingly, one of the versions of the English take on black dogs is the church grim, a black dog with glowing red eyes who protects a given church's graveyard from desecration or disturbance. And the church would create the church grim by, whenever they established a new graveyard, making sure that the first thing buried there was a giant black dog. Because the belief was that the first living thing buried in a graveyard upon its death, a new graveyard, was either a tithe to the devil or was a protection against the devil and his minions. And so, to keep that from happening to a person, they would bury a black dog first, and then the graveyard could be used for burial. And thus, the spirit of the dog buried would become a supernatural protector of the church and its property.
That is wild. I have never heard that. That's not one they teach you in Sunday school.
And in a book that I found from 1879, collecting folklore from Northern England and Southern Scotland, they specifically mention that there is known to be a black dog at a St. John's church in England. And I think at some point, somebody was doing research into the demon dog of Valley Crucis and ran across that and decided they must be talking about the St. John's church in Valley Crucis. And the story got mixed around. And so now you see people argue online about which Episcopal church is it.
This is great. I like the monster. I like the history that you found. This is awesome. This is a great one.
Thank you. Unfortunately, there are, of course, no citations, no names. There's nothing to historically verify, except that this is a story that was considered old in Valley Crucis even 100 years ago.
You need to go on a field trip.
Right? It really did make me want to do that. So I went looking for some classic sci-fi tie-ins. There are a ton of great ones. An honorable mention that I'll give is the movie Zoltan, Hound of Dracula from 1977. It is literally about Dracula's dog being a vampire who gets resurrected in the modern day, and it and its former owner, whom it has turned into a half vampire from the 17th century that it also brings back, travel to America to find the last living descendants of Dracula so that it can go turn them into vampires and restart the Dracula clan.
Wow.
Importantly, it is a legally distinct Dracula. It is a Dracula, not the Dracula. It's literally like supposed to be Dracula's nephew got turned into a vampire, and this is his dog. It's really funny. It's not a great film, but I love that it exists. There's also Devil Dog, Hound from Hell.
Seems a bit redundant.
It does. It's a TV movie from 1978, so it's not exactly a gore fest. It stars Richard Crenna. He was Troutman in First Blood and all the Rambo movies. He was also in Body Heat. He was on Jag. He was on The Real McCoys, if you happen to be one of those people like me who watched a lot of really old sitcoms as a kid. And he's definitely one of those, hey, it's that guy people. And Ike Eisenman, who's probably best known to science fiction fans as Scotty's nephew in Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, but also as one of the kids who are the leads in Escape from Witch Mountain in the 1970s, which I loved. In Devil Dog, Hound from Hell, a satanic cabal in the suburbs tie a perfectly nice German Shepherd to a post in the middle of a really lurid pentacle, summon the devil into it, and like pledge its soul to hell, and then make sure that it gets adopted by a suburban family where the rest of the family becomes Satanists because of this.
It was a different time, you see.
It was a different time.
And ritualistic possession of dogs was at an all-time high in the suburbs of the United States.
You just never know. This is some real, like, on the cutting edge of satanic panic kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so
and
I really
say at
that.
An all-time high because one story was told about it. And that one story represents the high bar.
Definitely. I do love this movie, though.
I'm picturing a lot of like shaky cam shots where it's like from the perspective of the dog, and the cameraman would just like run and hold the camera and be like, because, you know, getting a monster dog would be expensive.
It's as though you also have watched it, because that is a very accurate prediction. One of my favorite things about it is that it's a real fun, weird horror twist on the typical suburban boomer dad who is totally disconnected from what's happening in his family life sitcom setup, except it's a horror movie. He has no idea that this is happening to his family. And when he realizes that the rest of his family, who have very over the top been turned into Satanists, and he is shocked. It's really delightful. And that's my winner for like the best tie-in of Devil Dog.
Sure. Turned into Satanists by the possessed dog.
Yeah.
Ruff. You know what I should start doing? I should start worshiping the devil. The dog is right. It's a great.
Like at one point there's, satanic ritual stuff in his own attic and he's surprised by this. It's wild. I don't know.
What are you kids up to?
And then, and then when his family is like super casual about it, he's just like, okay.
Doesn't look like Pong. That dog is weird.
And that's the Devil Dog of Alicrucis.
Well, thank you. That was great. I like that. I love a good satanic panic story. I get a really big kick out of those. I like dogs. I like legends that you can tie to weird nuggets of information like the Grimm. So this is awesome. So that is going to be very hard for me to follow because you hit like all the right notes. And now I feel like mine is like extra silly.
No such thing. Don't you worry.
Originally, I was going to do a sea monster tale because, I like aquatic monsters.
Definitely.
And then what I came across was something that could be an aquatic monster that also flies, that also could be a land monster.
Okay.
Or it could be aliens.
I would believe that aliens are winged amphibians. Sure.
So let's go in our time machines to Columbia, South Carolina, May 29th, 1888. We've already talked about Columbia in some other episodes. I'm going to skip the history of Columbia and keep it rolling. An Associated Press article was written out of Columbia, picked up the next day by the New York Times, May 30th, 1888. And I'm going to read that article. Closely following the appearance of the hand of flame in the heavens above Ohio comes a story from Darlington County in this state, referring to South Carolina, of a flying serpent.
A hand of flame and a flying serpent. It was a good news week.
The hand of flame was in Ohio, so South Carolina had a flying snake. Last Sunday evening, just before sunset, Miss Ida Davis and her two younger sisters were strolling through the woods when they suddenly were startled by the appearance of a huge serpent moving through the air above them. So they're in the woods and they see a giant flying snake. The serpent was distant only 2 or 3 rods when they first beheld it. Good old-timey unit of measure. Cubits and rods and all that.
I did the conversion of rods for the Chimney Rock episode, but I will spare you the math.
And it was sailing through the air with the speed equal to that of a hawk or buzzard without any visible means of propulsion. Mistake! Its movements in flight resembled that of a snake, and it looked a formidable object as it wound its way along, approximately 15 feet in length.
Wow, that's pretty long snake.
Right? The girls stood amazed and followed it with their eyes until it was lost to view in the distance. The flying serpent was also seen by a number of people in other parts of the county early in the afternoon on the same day, and by those, it was said to have been emitting a hissing noise, which could be distinctly heard, which is my favorite part because it is. I'm a snake. I'm a flying snake.
I choose to believe that 2 snakes have built the first snake-a-pult, and they're just taking rides. They're just like slinging each other through the air for fun.
So we've got a big snake flying through the air. I think that counts as a cryptid. So I started looking into it. So the history of flying snakes as cryptids. Mesoamerican cultures, the Aztecs and the Mayans, both had stories and representations of flying serpent deities that appear in their codices, which were also reported by Spanish conquistadors, like in their reports of like what they found. Oh, and by the way, the local people have these flying snake sculptures everywhere and in their writings. So it's documented multiple times over that these cultures had that. Fiery flying serpents appear in Hebrew scriptures, Christian Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, with irregular fiery serpents. Engaging in what can best be described by the Dr. Raymond Stantz line from the documentary Ghostbusters, real wrath of God type stuff.
I was going to suggest hopefully not too sacrilegiously, that perhaps the flying fire snake is the, ultimate evolution of that Pokemon.
Right. So I do have, I want to read from the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 6. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people died.
Dang.
That's it. So, but that doesn't sound good. It sounds quite bad. More contemporarily, in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1970s, there are reports out of Nambia, the country, of a monstrous flying serpent that has been dubbed the Nambian flying snake, and it attacks cattle.
Whoa.
With farmers reporting on it, they're like, yeah, I saw this like weird thing out of the corner of my eye, heard a thud, my cow started mooing in agony and screaming, and I look over and there was this giant, what can best be described as a snake that had come flying out of nowhere and started attacking my cow.
Gosh.
So that's sort of like the nickel version of people having flying snakes as cryptids. Well, let's get into the science of flying snakes, because there are such things as flying snakes. They like flying squirrels. They just don't have the visible like membrane or wings, the skin that flying squirrels do, but they do glide from tree to tree. They don't have visible characteristics, as the original article mentioned. They're in what's called the Chrysopelia family, limbless vertebrates capable of flight. So they have their own section in science. They're mostly found in Southeastern Asia, and they are able to soar by using their ribs. They stretch their body out into a flattened strip, and they also make mid-air undulations.
Science is wild.
They can go 300 feet from one treetop to another.
I mean, that's a football field.
Yeah, they will launch themselves and like through the air into another one.
They make that sound. Okay.
That's going to make for great audio.
That is. It's going to be really good.
And here's where it gets a little nuts. So there's a researcher and professor of biomedical engineering and mechanics in Virginia Tech named Dr. Jake Soka. And for the past 2 decades, he has measured and modeled the biomechanics of snake flight because he's making mechanical flying snakes.
I'm not saying that I want to sign up as a minion in his army of evil that he is clearly assembling as part of his plan for world domination, but I am saying that I'd like to hear about their benefits package.
What are you going to do when the machine snakes rise up? The practical
Clearly, we're going to need mechanical mongooses.
Right. And then we build something mechanical to fight the mongooses, and that's how we wound up with our robot gorillas. So the practical application of his robot snakes is for search and rescue, where they can like drop one into a pile of rubble and it can get places that a person can't.
And it can leap from one pile of rubble to the next 300 feet away.
Right. So pretty wild stuff. So that brings us to the question of, so what is it that was seen in 1888? At the time, I read the New York Times reprint of the story out of Columbia, but Darlington County, where the event actually took place, only had one weekly newspaper at the time, the Darlington News, and reports from that month, the month of May, 1888, revealed that the majority of the Southeast was under the influence of a stationary violent weather system. And on the second half of the month, terrible storms were known to be sweeping over Ohio and Pennsylvania. In late May, a report out of Spartanburg County reported 2 drowning in a river swollen by recent heavy rains, and Marion County reported crop damage from heavy rain, bad winds, and hail. So I think we have a snake riding a current. I think they really saw a giant snake. It was really moving through the air, and it was just riding this weather system.
I'm just going to think this through. So you got a big snake. It's up in a tree. It's minding its own business. Along comes, not exactly a hurricane, but it's a big gust of wind. Foosh, off it goes through the air. It is caught by surprise. So it is hissing angrily the whole way. Yeah, it's doing the snake version of yelling, "Hey, what the heck, man?" And then these people see it. I would never have guessed at the beginning of this that I would say, I buy it.
Yeah, it was. Here's some twists and turns. On April 28th, 1987, the National Enquirer featured an article titled "UFOs Have Been Here for Centuries." That article is written by somebody named Franklin R. Rule, and near the conclusion of the article throws in a statement. In May of 1888, a mammoth serpent-like UFO was seen again in the United States. The site was Darlington County, South Carolina. So this guy I think it was kind of an identified object. I don't know that it qualifies as UFO, but this guy was trying to like throw it in the UFO pile with the obvious implication being aliens, which is funny. There's also a magazine called Ireland's Own, out of Ireland, that was doing an article on flying serpents and included a little throwaway line that I could not corroborate with anything else, that the snake appeared again elsewhere the same day at a place called Grassland, and it flew past a Methodist church, and the glint of sunlight off the weather vane attracted it, and it began to drop out of the sky and circle the church menacingly. But that kind of just feels like an embellishment to me. I don't know.
That sounds a little bit embroidered. It's a little too cute, as a coda to the story.
Right. I didn't include that in what I consider the actual tale. I really want to find out about this giant flying snake that attacks cows now. But anyway, moving on, pop culture and sci-fi tie-ins. The first parallel I could think of would be Sharknado, where what if this was a sea serpent that was displaced from the ocean and cursed to fly about?
I just like the idea that, like, I don't know, Neptune basically is like hanging out off the coast of South Carolina, and there's one sea serpent that he's like, you out of the pool.
And I imagine it happening, like grabbing it by the tail and like swinging it to like get the momentum going, and and then when he does throw it just like noodles, like
or it's like in a Bugs Bunny cartoon where it's like traveling the world, And the second time that it comes back around to Darlington, then it's like covered in stickers from different places.
Right. Maybe it's maybe we could somehow tie this to Snakes on a Plane if the snakes were jumping out of the plane. I did find a movie from 1982. It was a monster horror titled, it has many titles. The Winged Serpent, Q the Winged Serpent, or Q. It was a total bomb. It was produced and directed by Larry Cohen, starring Michael Moriarty, Candy Clark, David Carradine, and Richard Roundtree. So it had like people you recognize in it.
Yeah.
And it had some really cool stop motion monster stuff, like old timey models. And I will admit that it can tie back to the Mesoamerican legends. The depiction of it is less snaky and more dragony. Like it has limbs.
Right.
They kind of took some liberties with the depiction of the creature that they lifted from older legends. But anyway, flying snakes. Who knew?
That's awesome.
I think it's real. I think these people really saw a flying snake.
Yeah. I don't really have any particular reason to disbelieve them. Yeah. It's not like they then tried to open the Flying Snake Emporium and attract people to spend money on them.
Get your flying snake bobbleheads. Get your flying snake toys.
So then for the third one, and I promise I'll try to keep this one brief. The third one is the Wampus Cat of Georgia. Yay. The Dragon Con is. What is the Wampus Cat? The Wampus Cat, according to legend, is a fearsome creature that is half mountain lion, half woman, that stalks the forests of northeast Georgia, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and northwest South Carolina. But there are Wampus Cat legends from northern Alabama, Oklahoma, basically anywhere the Cherokee people have wound up.
And to be clear, this isn't like a mermaid situation like top half woman, bottom half cat.
It depends on the depiction.
Oh, see, I didn't know that.
To my understanding, it is not a mermaid type creature, but you never know.
Top half cat, bottom half woman, then.
It might be. I don't know. So Wampus cats have been seen and reported for hundreds of years, up to and including the 21st century. There have been Wampus cat sightings and reports in Knoxville, Tennessee in the last year.
Really?
Yeah.
See, that's why I'm like, I need to know, is this a mermaid situation or is this just like a giant cat? Like,
I think it's more like a cat person.
It'd just be freaky to like look out and be like, ah.
Yeah, it would be very freaky. There are two versions of the origin of the Wampus cat. And the first version is that a horrible monster named Ewa, which was the embodiment of madness for the Cherokee, had been afflicting the people of a specific Cherokee town named Etowah. The Cherokee town of Etowah in modern day Georgia was near where modern day Hightower, Georgia is located, which is an hour or so northeast of where Dragon Con is happening right now. It's actually believed that the town name Hightower is a mispronounced anglicization of Etowah.
I could definitely see that.
Yeah. Ewa had the form of a giant cat with shining golden eyes, and much like the devil dog, this was a glow that came from within. This was not a reflection of anything. Ewa had the power to drive mad any person who looked it in the eye.
So what a crappy monster. Gotta make you cry.
It's kind of a Medusa story.
Right.
I kind of love that.
Jerk.
In this version of the legend, this Cherokee hunter named Standing Bear volunteered to go in search of Iwa to hunt and kill it because it was afflicting the village. It was stalking the hunters of the village when they got into the woods and preventing them from catching game and coming back. So Standing Bear volunteered to go out hunting it. He was gone for days. Nobody had any idea what was up. And then when he came back, he was nearly catatonic because he had made the mistake of looking Iwa in the eye and being driven mad.
What is Iwa's motivation? Do we know?
Force of nature.
Okay.
In the version most often repeated online, the fact that Standing Bear was now functionally catatonic was caused within his culture to be sort of declared dead. I can't find any verification of that. And I think it's important to point that out because, in fact, in Cherokee culture, disabled people were still considered part of the community and were not treated that way. I think that that's a case of the West, when they chronicled this kind of stuff, sort of imposing their own standards on it and trying to make it sound more brutal than it was.
I'm not dead yet.
Right. In this version, because of that, then Standing Bear's wife, Running Deer, says to the rest of the village, okay, I'm going to go get revenge on Iwa for doing this to my husband. And that's why I think that when this was written down by settlers later, it was changed because in Cherokee culture, women dispensed justice. And I think that they were trying to impose their own gender roles on Cherokee culture. They were not comfortable with the idea of reporting that it was normal in Cherokee culture for women to go seeking revenge.
Yeah, because this isn't the version that I know at all.
Yeah. Running Deer, upon this having happened to her husband, says, I'm going to go get revenge. I'm going to stalk Iwa and kill it. I'm going to do what he could not do. And the elders of the village said, okay, that's great. We're going to give you some stuff to help you in this task. And what they gave her was a preserved face of a wildcat that had been turned into a mask, and its pelt was still attached as a cape. And they said, we will enchant this so that you can use this to sneak up on Iwa and appear to Iwa as a giant cat. So Running Deer goes out into the woods. She spends days stalking Iwa through the forest, using this disguise to evade Iwa's notice. And then when she catches Iwa standing at the bank of a river, she jumps out behind Iwa. The theory was that Iwa would see her in this disguise and either be scared because he would think that it was another of him, or think that he was seeing his own reflection. But either way, would be driven mad by the possibility that he had looked himself in the eye. It's a weird, complex take.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah. So she jumps out in her disguise. Iwa looks at her, is immediately terrified, falls backwards into the river, and is washed away. And afterwards, it became Running Deer's job in the village to stalk the woods, waiting for the return of Iwa or the appearance of any other sort of hostile spirit that she might need to drive away using this disguise. And as a reward for her service to the village allowed this cloak to let her sort of turn into a cat person when she needed to for the purposes of stalking the woods.
That is much better than... Yeah, it's like a cloak.
Yeah.
Okay.
The second version of it is way less interesting, and it's that a, quote, nosy woman wrapped herself in a mountain lion pelt to disguise herself and followed the men of her village when they went on a fishing trip because she wanted to spy on whatever ritual they performed before and after fishing.
This is the version that I knew.
Yeah. And then when they caught her, then it turned out that one of the men in the fishing party was a magician, and he used magic to trap her as a half woman, half cat using this pelt. And thus she becomes Iwa.
Oh, see, I didn't know that she became Iwa. I didn't know about the Iwa stuff at all.
Yeah. But this version blatantly ignores everything we know about Cherokee culture. I'm not Cherokee. I'm not trying to claim that I am. I do not have a perfect understanding of it. But if you want to read a lot of really fascinating stuff about Cherokee culture pre-colonization from Cherokee people, then look up the book, The Cherokee Perspective. There will be a link to it right here. I'll put up a bit.ly link to it because it was published by the federal government in the 80s and is freely available. And it's really fascinating, and it was assembled by Cherokee students and scholars.
So now hearing the version that I was aware of, the version that you just shared, compared to the version that we discussed in the Choratry episode, I'm like extra aggravated at that version where I'm like, come on. The third version that I don't know if you're going to cover that or not, but that third version is like, what?
I don't have a third version, so please, what is it?
Well, the third version from the Choratry episode is that a witch's enchanted familiar became a wampus cat.
Right.
And I'm like, that has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, that's totally unrelated.
Yeah.
But everything that we know about Cherokee culture, pre-colonization, is the women were equal partners in everything. There were traditional gender roles in that women tended to take care of the farming and men tended to take care of the hunting. And there were definitely ritual forms and religious observations around hunting that were unique to hunting. And so it's possible that they would not want someone who was not participating in hunting or fishing to observe those rituals. But the rigid patriarchy angle on this story is awfully Eve and the Forbidden Fruit for my tastes. And again, it just kind of smacks of Western settlers having decided to impose their own gender roles on Cherokee culture because it made them uncomfortable that their gender roles were very different.
Hello, and welcome to the first time in Arcane Carolinas the phrase rigid patriarchy has ever been said.
This is my thing, though. You know
I know,
me.
it's fine. I get it. It's just funny where I'm just like, this took a turn. I didn't see it coming.
It did. I read a lot in preparation for this episode about Cherokee
and
gender
you're not
roles
wrong.
Because,
to be clear, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just laughing like, how did we get here?
We got here because I'm me. I don't know. But I did do a lot of reading about Cherokee culture because it kept bothering me that these were the representations. And I was like, I want to find something that either confirms that this was true about Cherokee culture or directly contradicts it. And everything I found directly contradicted it. So the classic sci-fi tie-in, though, for the Wampus Cat, my favorite anyway, is the 1977 version of The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Oh, okay. Yes. Now I can picture the animal people. Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
The great Michael York from Logan's Run, Wild Wild West, Babylon 5, all kinds of stuff. He plays the hero of the film. Burt Lancaster won a bunch of Oscars and a bunch of Tonys. From Here to Eternity, The Unforgiven, Trial at Nuremberg. Believe me, if you don't know who he is, look him up. You have seen him in something. And Barbara Carrera, who is a very accomplished visual artist and model and did a bunch of acting also in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Barbara Carrera plays Maria, a woman who has been turned into a half woman, half puma, and is more or less the love interest of Michael York's character. In the original H.G. Wells, she's referred to as a virago, which these days is used as a slur for a woman who is considered too domineering, but originally was used as a complimentary term for a particularly heroic and powerful woman warrior. That's the origin of the word. And in the movie, Maria is kind of a werecat, but in the original story, she has been surgically transformed, the original H.G. Wells, and may originally have been a puma given human traits through surgery. I like this tie-in in part because the two versions of the legend that I gave each contain some really important similarities to the two versions of the original story and the movie, which are, in one, she's transformed into a cat as an act of cruelty, a la legend number 2. In another, she's an agent of revenge for wrongdoing, a la legend number 1. In both, the mingling of human and animal traits makes her fearsomely inhuman, but she retains cunning and intelligence, which I always like in a villain, if they're going to be the villain of the story. And I especially like a hero who is monstrous, but not. And I like this tie-in because, for a self-plug, my novel of Fallen Autumn does include a bunch of uplifted animals who've been given human traits. So, did the Cherokee really have this story? Well, I went and found the oldest and probably best collection of Cherokee myths that I can find, which is a book called Myths of the Cherokee, assembled by a researcher named Mooney. It's published in 1898 by the Bureau of American Ethnology, which is by far the most comprehensive volume on Cherokee beliefs and culture produced in a time when pre-Trail of Tears, pre-removal Cherokee culture was still in living memory. And in its 500 plus pages, there are a bunch of mentions of Etowah, because it was close to a bunch of really important historical stuff, and a handful of mentions of Wildcat as an actor in Cherokee cosmology, but there is no mention of Ewa or Standing Bear or Running Deer or anything like that. There's no mention of Wampus Cats, nothing. And the Cherokee have always been really good at keeping their culture free of contamination that way. And they may have kept a lot of their own beliefs for themselves rather than sharing them with outsiders. And so it's possible that they have this legend and it's just not in that book, but it's also possible that both versions of that legend were manufactured to try to impose Western standards on Cherokee culture.
That would be interesting, especially because the appearance and sightings of Wampus Cats has, as you mentioned, run off over the decades. And there's even a high school in Georgia that has a Wampus Cat as a mascot.
There are 5 schools in the United States that have the Wampus Cat as their mascot.
Wow.
Now, that said, it's very possible that they really did have this legend, because
Sure.
were creatures are probably the most common legend across human culture, period, historically, but especially in indigenous cultures in the Americas, because the Olmecs, who are sort of the oldest culture that we know of, where we have a lot of information about their culture, placed huge importance on the idea of were-jaguars and were-pumas. And that importance in their culture was transmitted to subsequent cultures that were sort of their cultural descendants, including to the Mississippians, who are the cultural forebears of basically every tribe of Native Americans in the southeastern United States.
It's interesting that you mentioned the were creatures. I use quotes because there are so many different were creatures.
Yeah.
We have been asked repeatedly to talk about a specific kind of were creature, and I keep kicking the can down the road on that because I'm trying to figure out how the story is going to work from a narrative perspective. So I'm glad that we finally covered a were creature adjacent topic, even though it's not the one people have been asking for.
Totally. That's the Legend of the Wampus Cat.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I learned something today.
I'm really glad you did.
We are Charlie and Michael of Arcane Carolinas. We hope you enjoyed our panel, show, whatever you want to call our participation. Thank you to the folks that had us. Thank you for watching. Check out www.arcanecarolinas.com. You can get to all of our social media, our web store, our Patreon. We will happily send you some free swag for taking the time to watch us. Just email us, arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. Put DragonCon in the subject line.
And don't forget, one person who emails us is going to win a book from me, and one person who emails us is going to win a giant pack of swag.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Yeah. And you can find all my books at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com.
This is awesome. Thanks so much for having us and for sharing your time.
Yeah. See you next year.
I just reached for the stop button, and I'm not the one that's supposed to stop it today.
Oh, I'm so glad we're going to be able to edit this. That might be our stinger. I don't know.
There you go.